I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Yes, you guessed it right. The poet about whom I would like to speak up today is none other than William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was born in his beloved Lake District in England in the year 1770. He was the son of an attorney. He was an English poet whose lyrical ballads, written with Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the year 1798, helped launch the English Romantic movement. It would not be wrong to say that the genre of English Romantic poems is rooted in him. He went to school first at Penrith and then at Hogshead Grammar School, before studying from 1787 at St. John's College, Cambridge. In 1790, he went with his friends on a walking tour to France. Returning to England, he wrote and left unpublished his letter to the Bishop of Llandaff, a tract in support of the French revolutionary cause. In 1795, after receiving a legacy, Wordsworth lived with his sister Dorothy. In these years, he wrote many of his greatest poems. 2 years later, the second and enlarged edition of the lyrical ballads appeared in 1801. This was followed in 1807 by the publication of poems in 2 volumes, which included the poems Resolution and Independence and Intimations of Immorality from Recollections of Early Childhood. He received a civil list of pension in 1842 and was made Poet Laureate just 1 year later. Today, Wordsworth's poetry remains widely read. Its almost universal appeal is perhaps best explained by Wordsworth's own words. The most philosophical of all writing is truth, carried alive into the heart by passion. Wordsworth died in 1850, leaving behind his rich collection of poetry.
In 3 words, I can sum up everything I have learned about life. It goes on. It's a quotation of my favorite poet, Robert Frost. He was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California. He was one of the most popular and critically acclaimed poets in history. He was regarded as the greatest American poet of 20th century. Frost is highly regarded for his deep understanding of human nature, which led to a brilliant dramatic screen in his poetry. He is well known for his realistic writing of rural life and his use of American informal speech. During his lifetime, Frost received more than 40 honorary degrees. Frost was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for 4 times. In 1924, he got his first Pulitzer Prize for his book New Hampshire. He would subsequently win Pulitzer Prizes for his book Collection Poems in 1931, A Future Rains in 1937, and A Witness Train in 1943. In 1960, Congress awarded Frost the Congressional Gold Medal. At last, the great poet died on January 29, 1963. Thank you.
William Wordsworth, more than any other great English poet, was a poet for mature and thoughtful appreciation. He was born in the year 1770 and spent his life in the Lake District of northern England. Wordsworth was one of the leading figures of the Romanticism movement. He started this movement with Samuel Taylor Coleridge with their collection of the lyrical ballads in 1798. When most poets still wrote about ancient heroes in the grandiloquent style, Wordsworth focused on the nature, the children, the common people, and the poor. He used ordinary words to express his personal feelings. In 1798, he started to write a large and philosophical autobiographical poem which was completed in 1805 and published posthumously in 1850 under the title The Prelude. In his second collection, poems in 2 volumes were produced in the year 1807. He also became a Poet Laureate of England in the year 1840.
Hello, I'm Pratikpa. Robert Frost a poet who has been known because of his quotes. He was born in San Francisco, California. Robert's father, William Prescott Frost Jr., was a teacher. After Robert's father's death, the family moved across the country to Lawrence. Robert's mother, Isabel Moody, joined the Swedenborgian Church. In 1894, he sold his first poem, My Butterfly and Elegy, for $15. In 1960, Robert was awarded a United States Congressional Gold Medal. Robert was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 31 times. On January 29, 1963, Robert Frost died of complications from prostate surgery. Last but not the least, I would like to quote a quote written by Robert Frost. If we couldn't love, we would all go insane.
Wordsworth. William Wordsworth is a poet for mature and thoughtful appreciation. He is one of the English poets who made the largest contribution to thought and life. He was born in 7 April 1770 in Cockermouth, Lake District of London and died in 23 April 1850 in London. During the Romantic period of British poetry, William became one of the leading figures of the Romanticism movement. He started this movement with Samuel Taylor Coleridge with their collection of lyrical ballads in 1798. When many other poets wrote about the ancient heroes in grandiloquent style, William focused on the nature, the children, the poor, and the common people. He used ordinary words to express his personal feelings. William lost his mother at the age of 8, and at the age of 13 he lost his father as well. William's uncle helped him to enter a local school. In the year 1787, he published a sonnet in the European magazine for the first time as a writer, and in the same year he entered St. John's College, Cambridge, from where he took BA in 1791. Some of William's quotes contain a good amount of humor, such as, "Golf is a day spent in a round of strenuous idleness, and nature never did betray the man that loved her." For William Wordsworth, nature is a direct manifestation of the divine power. That is, we can communicate to God through the nature. To William, nature is man's one great and sufficient teacher. William is a poet of nature. He is a poet with deep faith in the minds of the power and a developing awareness of the encounter of the mind and a larger reality. So to that extent, his life was truly a poetic life, and with this I conclude. Thank you.
The son of a livery stable manager, John Keats received relatively little formal education. His father died in 1804 and his mother remarried almost immediately. Throughout his life, Keats had close emotional ties to his sister Fanny and his two brothers, George and Tom. After the breakup of their mother's second marriage, the Keats children lived with their widowed grandmother at Edmonton.
If we are even a bit familiar with the history of English literature, then we must surely know about the influence of William Wordsworth and his works in shaping the structure of English literature during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This renowned poet of nature was the one to introduce the Romantic age in literature by his joint publication of lyrical ballads with Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798. Wordsworth spent almost his entire lifetime of 80 years in England during the years 1770 and 1850.
Wordsworth was born on 17th April 1770 in Cockersmouth in the Cumberland County of England. He was the second of 5 children born to Christopher and Annie Cookson Wordsworth. Both his parents passed away by the time he was 13. After being brought up by different relatives for a while, he was sent to the Hawkshead Grammar School in the Lake District, where he received a prestigious education in English literature and classics, while also indulging in the beautiful English countryside. His environment fostered in him a love for nature, which was later reflected in his poems. He became widely famous for his poems and succeeded Robert Southey as poet laureate in 1843. William Wordsworth died in 1950 after being affected by pleurisy for 2 years. His great autobiographical poem, The Prelude, was published posthumously.
Greetings to ma'am. Someone once said, I am by nature a great dealer in words, and the words are the most powerful drugs known to humankind. Indeed, it was stated by Rudyard Kipling, one of the most favored English writers of all the times. He contributed immensely in children's literature, poetry, short stories, science fiction.
William Butler Yeats was born on June 13, 1865 in Dublin, Ireland, as the oldest child of John Butler Yeats and Susan Mary Pollexfen. Yeats spent much of his childhood in London, where his father was studying art, but frequently visited Ireland as well. In the mid-1880s, he pursued his interest in art as a student at the Metropolitan School of Art in Dublin, Ireland. While he was mostly fascinated by otherworldly elements, his interest in Ireland, especially its folk tales, fueled much of his imagination. The title of his work, The Wanderings of Oisin and Other Poems, draws from the story of a mythic Irish hero. In addition to poetry, he devoted significant energy to writing plays as well.
John Keats was born on 31 October 1795 and died on 22 February 1821. He was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets, with Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley.
I am going to talk about Robert Lee Frost. Robert Lee Frost was an American poet-writer. His work was initially published in England before it was published in United States. He was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco, and he died in 29 January 1963 in Boston.
Robert Lee Frost was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco, California, US. He was an American poet. His work was initially published in England before it was published in the United States. He was known for his realistic depictions of rural life. Frost frequently wrote about settings of rural life in New England.
Percy Bysshe Shelley, also known as P.B. Shelley. P.B. Shelley was one of the major English Romantic poets and was considered to be a superb craftsman and one of the most advanced intellects to ever write poems. He was known for his poetic imagery, his mastery of genres and verse forms, and his materialist ideas in his work. Shelley was a student of Oxford University, where he wrote just prose. Along with his sister Elizabeth Shelley, he wrote original poetry by Victor and Keziah. His best known works are Ozymandias, Ode to the West Wind, To the Skylark, etc.
Robert Frost was born in San Francisco, California. His father's name was William Prescott Frost and his mother's name was Isabel Moody. In 1894, he first sold his poem, which he named as My Butterfly, the Elsie. His works were initially published in England before it was published in the United States. Robert Frost generally wrote about the rural life setting in New England in the early 20th century. He had got many awards in his lifetime.
The Bird of Avon, who produced some of the most impressive works of English literature, is none other than the genius William Shakespeare. He was a writer of great intellectual ability and poetic power. It is quite hard to swallow the fact that one individual producing about 38 plays, 154 sonnets, 2 narrative poems, and a few other verses which are almost universally recognized as some of the greatest works in the history of English literature. Shakespeare is arguably one of the most famous writers of all time.
About John Keats. John Keats, the famous English poet. He was one of the most gifted poets in the 19th century. He was born in London in 31st October 1795. Though he became an orphan at an early age, Anyway, he was educated in the Clerk's School in Anfield. He studied medicine but did not practice his profession, deciding instead to be a poet. Now let us see some of his work. The first major poem, this sonnet on looking into the champion's Homer. The first poem, this sonnet, O Solitude, 1816.
I am going to speak about on a famous poet, William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was the leading poet during the Romantic period in the English language and literature. He was born at Cockermouth, Cumberland in the Lake District on 7th April 1770. William Wordsworth began his literary career as a poet at an early age. His noted poetic works, An Evening Walk and descriptive sketches, are of high order. His first fruit of genius was given out in the Lyrical Ballads. This publication of this monumental work ushered the new era of Romanticism in English poetry. The Prelude is an autobiographical poem consisting of 14 parts. Wordsworth remained a true interpreter of nature to humanity.
John Keats. John Keats is an English poet born in London on 31st October 1795. He is one of the most gifted and appealing poets of the 19th century. Keats studied medicine and became a licensed apothecary, but he never practiced his profession, deciding to be a poet. Keats wrote his first extant poem, An Imitation of Spenser, in 1814. The first volume of his verse was published in 1817. His second volume, Endymion, was published in 1818. However, these books were a critical failure, arousing little interest. But Keats' poetry became famous after his death on 23 February 1821. His poetry was recognized in the 20th century for its technical and intellectual achievement. Though his poems were indifferently received during his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death.
P.B. Shelley is one of the epic poets of the 19th century. His full name was Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was born on August 4, 1972. He was born and raised in the English countryside in the village Broadbridge, just outside of West Sussex. His parents were Timothy Shelley and Elizabeth Wilford. Shelley first married to Harriet, then fell interest on Mary, daughter of Shelley's beloved mentor Godwin. He is well known for his long-form poetry such as Queen Mab and Alistair. His best-known classic poems are Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark and the Cloud.
Percy Bysshe Shelley was one of the major English Romantic poets. He was born on 4 August 1792 in Horsham, England. He is best known for his classic anthology works such as Ode to the West Wind and Mask of Anarchy. The famous poem Ozymandias was written by him. Some of his poems, such as Julian and Meadow, Spirit of Solitude, etc., are considered to be his masterpieces. Some of his notable books, such as Queen Mab, To a Skylark, Defense of the Poetry, etc., are worth mentioning.
Wordsworth was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California. His father was William Prescott Force and mother was Isabel Moody. In 1982, he was graduated from Lawrence High School. Force grew up in the city and he published his first poem in his high school magazine.
Frost, born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California, and died on January 29, 1963, was an American poet. His work was initially published in England before it was established in the United States. Known for his realistic depictions of rural life and his command of American colloquial speech, Frost frequently wrote settings from rural life in New England in the early 20th century.
Robert Lee Frost was an American poet who was born on 26 March 1874. His work was initially published in England before it was published in United States. From childhood onwards, he liked writing poems. He was inspired by such a contemporary British poet. He sold his first poem, My Butterfly and Elegy, which was published Nature.
William Shakespeare, born in the year 1564, Shakespeare was one of the greatest English playwright, actor, and poet. He is regarded as one of the greatest writers in English language and world's greatest dramatist. The Merchant of Venice, The Merry Wives of Windsor are some of his great works.
Whitman. Walt Whitman was born on May 31, 1819 in West Hills, Long Island, New York. He was an American poet, essayist, and journalist. At the age of 12, Whitman began to learn printer's trade and fell in love with the written word. Largely self-taught, he read ferociously, becoming acquainted with the works of Homer, Dante, and the Bible.
William Wordsworth, one of the most influential of England's Romantic poets, was born on 7th April 1770 at Cockermouth in Cumbria. Both Wordsworth's parents died before he was 15, and he and his 4 siblings were left in the care of different relatives. He began to write poetry while he was at school, but none was published until 1793. Wordsworth's most famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, was written at Dove Cottage in 1804. In 1802, Wordsworth married a childhood friend, Mary Hutchinson. The next few years were personally difficult for Wordsworth as 2 of his children died. His brother was drowned at sea and his sister, Dorothy, suffered from a mental breakdown. After 1835, he wrote a little more. In 1842, he was given a government pension, and the following year he became poet laureate. Wordsworth died on 23rd April 1850 and was buried in Grasmere churchyard. His great autobiographical poem, The Prelude, which he had worked on since 1798, was later published after his death in 1850 by his wife Mary Hutchinson.
Born in Huntington on Long Island as a child and through much of his career, Walter Whitman resided in Brooklyn. Walter Whitman was an American poet, essayist, and a journalist. A humanist, he was a part of transition between transcendentalism and realism, incorporating both views in his work. Walter Whitman is among the most influential poets in American canon. Often called the father of free verse, his work was controversial at its time.
This video is about John Keats. John Keats was born in Moorgate, London on 31st October 1795 to Thomas and Frances Keats. He was the eldest of 4 children. His young siblings were George, Tom, and Fanny. When he was 8 years old, his father died due to a skull fracture, and his mother died due to tuberculosis when he was 14 years old. John Keats was a well-known English romantic lyric poet who devoted his short life to the perfection of the poetry marked by vivid imagery.
It may be that his mentally sane beside modernity numbers since a nastic tune. It may be thought has broadened since he died upon the century's snow. A phrase written by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was an English poet, a key figure of Romanticism, and the author of the most famous poem ever written about daffodils. Born in 1770 at Cockermouth, his boyhood was happy. He could roam among the fields of his beloved countryside. Wordsworth and his friend Samuel Taylor invented a new style of poetry in which nature and the diction of common men trumped formal, stylish language.
John Keats. John Keats was one of the greatest English poets. He was born in London on 29 October 1795. He lost his father when he was 9 years old and lost his mother when he was 15. After leaving school, Keats became an assistant to a doctor. During this time, he met some of the greatest writers and poets of the time. Inspired by them, he gave up his job and started writing poems. Keats brought out his first volume of poetry in 1817
When he was only 22 years old, his health began to fall and he had an attack of tuberculosis, which was considered a very serious and almost incurable disease in those times. But despite this dreaded disease, he continued to write poems. In fact, he wrote some of his finest poems when he was dying of this mortal disease.
William Wordsworth was born on 7 April 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland, in the Lake District. His father was Johnny Wordsworth, Sir James Lowther's attorney. The magnificent landscape deeply affected Wordsworth's imagination and gave him a love of nature. He lost his mother when he was 8 and 5 years later his father.
John Keats was born on 31 October 1795. His father's name was Thomas Keats, who died in 1804 in a horse riding accident. He left Keats and his civilization under the soft care of his mother, Frances Janney. John Keats was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poems, with Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Also, his poem has been published after the 4 years of his death.
P.B. Shelley. P.B. Shelley was one of the major English Romantic poets born on 4 August 1792. American literary critic Harold Bloom described him as a superb craftsman, a lyric poet without rival, and surely one of the most advanced practical intellects ever to write a poem.
Walter Whitman was an American poet, essayist, and journalist. He was born on 31 May 1819. A humanist, he was a part of the transition between transcendentalism and religion.
William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was born in 7th April 1770 in the Lake District of Northern England. He lost his mother when he was 7 and his father when he was 13. He was sent to a grammar school at the Hawkshead of Lake District by his guardian uncle. There he received an excellent education in classic literature and mathematics, but the chief advantage to him was the boyhood pleasure of living and playing in the outdoors.
In the field of poetic literature, William Shakespeare occupies a unique position that no writer can compare to. William Shakespeare was born on 26 April 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. He is an English poet, playwright, and an actor who is widely regarded as the greatest writer in English language and the best dramatist. He is often called as England's national poet and the bird of Avon. His works consist of some 39 plays, 154 sonnets, 3 long narrative poems, and some other verses. Spring, Winter, and A Lover's Complaint are some of his well-known poems. Shakespeare's writing comprises of humorous emotions and the conflict within himself. Although his private life is shrouded in mystery and not much is known about his education, it is said that he started his career in London in between 1585 and 1592. Sadly enough, he died on 23rd April 1616.
John Donne was born into a Catholic family in the year 1572 during a strong anti-Catholic period in England. Donne's father, also named John, was a prosperous English merchant in London. His mother was Elizabeth Haywood. He entered the University of Oxford at the age of 11 and later joined the Cambridge University, but had never achieved any degree due to his Catholicism. His first books of poems were satires, songs, and sonnets. In 1610, he published his anti-Catholic polemic named as Pseudo-Martyr. He died in the year 1631. Thank you.
Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Walt Whitman, born on 1819, was an American essayist, journalist, and a poet. He was born on Long Island, but later he shifted to Brooklyn. He was one of the most influential poets during American canon and often called him as the father of free verse. His works were highly controversial during his period, especially for his poetry collections. He also worked as a teacher, a clerk, and a journalist. Some of the world famous poems written by him were Ice in the Body, Electric, O Captain, My Captain, and The Song of Myself.
Robert Frost is an American poet who writes simply but insightfully about common ordinary experiences. He is highly regarded for his deep understanding of human nature, leading to brilliant dramatic monologues or dramatic scenes in his poetry. He is known for his realistic depictions of rural life, capturing the rhythms of actual speech and depicting the human response to nature's process. In 1960, he was awarded the United States Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian award in US.
Keats. John Keats was born on 31st October 1795. He was an English poet, prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets. With Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley, although his poem had been published for only 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25. He was indifferently received in his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death.
I, Francis Bro from Class 10B is going to deliver a short speech on John Keats. John Keats, who was one of the most gifted and appealing poets of the 19th century. He was born in London 31st October 1795. He became an orphan at an early age. He was educated in the Clark School in Enfield. Keats also studied medicine, but he did not give much attention to his profession, and instead decided to be a poet. At last, he died in February 23, 1821.
One of the greatest of English poets is John Keats. He was born in London in the year 1795. Keats, who became so famous later on, was not so bright and brilliant in his boyhood. He began his medical profession in the year 1810 but gave it up after a few years in the year 1817. In the meantime, his innate and inherent love for literature made him study and learn Greek and English literature. Keats then started writing poems, of which Ode Autumn, Ode to a Nightingale are worth mentioning. But this great poet was consumed and attacked by a consumption. The disease was detected in the year 1820. Even though Keats went to Italy to cure it, he wasn't able to do so, and hence died a premature death in the year 1821. Despite the short life, John Keats is one of the greatest and finest poets England has ever produced.
John Keats was one of the most gifted and appealing of the 19th century. He was born in London in October 31, 1795 and was one of the eldest of 4 children. Although he died at the young age of 25 due to some illness, he had perhaps the most remarkable career of any English poet.
Lee Frost, New England's cherished poet, born on 26 March 1874, San Francisco, California. He is well known as America's purest lyricist and one of the most outstanding poets of the 20th century, and the 4th winner of Pulitzer Prize. An essential pastoral poet often associated with the rural New England.
Hello everyone, today my topic is on the famous American poet Robert Frost. Full name Robert Lee Frost. He was born in California on March 26, 1874. On 1894, he sold his first poem, My Butterfly and Elegy, for $15. The critic and poet Randall Jarrell often praised Robert's poetry along with Stephen and Eliot, which seems to me the greatest American poet of this century.
Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. This famous quote belonged to one of the most figures in the American poetry, one of the famous female American poet, Emily Elizabeth Dickinson. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was a prolific writer and created nearly 1800 poems in her lifetime. She is known for her bold original verse, poignant and compressed verse, which profoundly influenced the direction of 20th century poetry. The power of nature is a recurring theme in the poetry of Emily Dickinson. She uses this theme in one of her poems, Nature is What We See. The power of nature is strongly portrayed in that poem and what she sees in the nature. The poetry of Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost contains similar themes and ideas. Both poets attempt to romanticize nature, both focus on the power of nature, death and loneliness. Some of her famous poems include Fate is a Fine Invention, Success is Counted Sweetest, Wild Nights, If I Could Stop One's Heart from Breaking, and many more. Being such one of the most popular female American poet of 19th century, she didn't win any awards in her lifetime because female poets were not much appreciated at that time. But after her death, many other poems of her were published, and Emily Dickinson's poetic achievement deemed her America's best-known female poet and legend in the American literature.
If winter comes, can spring be far behind? The writer of this famous line from the poem Ode to the West Wind, P.B. Shelley, exemplified the same hope and enthusiasm for a better, happier, ideal world in both his poetry and through his rebellious spirit in life. Among Shelley's best-known works are Ozymandias and Ode to the West Wind. His other major works include prose fiction, which made him an important influence on subsequent generations of poets. Although he did not achieve fame during his lifetime, yet recognition of his achievements in poetry grew steadily following his death. Shelley's poetry is infused with passionate revolutionary ideals and a keen search for love and social justice. His writings display an urge to reform age-old systems and beliefs, fascination for nature, and an untamed spirit of visionary imagination and freedom. That is why his poetry and writings are still relevant to our times. Thank you.
Robert Lee Frost was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California. He was a noted and a critically respected American poet of 19th century. Majority of his works have been published in England as well as in America. His famous works includes Fire and Ice, Mending Wall, Out, Nothing Gold Can Stay, and Home Burial. His 1916 poem, The Road Not Taken, is often read at graduation ceremonies across the United States. At the end, he became one of America's rare public literary figures, almost an artistic institution. On 29th of January.
Hello everyone, I'd like to say a few words on William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was born in April 1564 in the United Kingdom. He was born to John and Mary and was the oldest of 7 siblings. He attended his school from the age of 7 until he was 15 years old. Further, he married Anne Hathaway in the late 1582 and has 3 children. He was an English poet, playwright, and actor, widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and the world's greatest dramatist. He is often known as England's national poet and the Bard of Avon. His extant work, including collaboration, consists of 39 plays, 154 sonnets, 3 long narrative poems, and a few other verses.
William Wordsworth was born on 7 April 1770. He was an English romantic poet, with whom Samuel Taylor Coleridge helped to launch the Romantic Age in English literature with their joint publication Ridiculous Ballads in 1798. Wordsworth was a magnum opus generally considered to be the prelude and a semi-biographical account celebrating the self and presenting the awesome imaginative capacity of the poet. William Wordsworth was really popular among his readers, and his works made him sit on the position of poet laureate of Britain in 1831, and he was buried at St. Oswald Church, Grasmere, UK on 23rd April 1850.
Robert Frost was born in San Francisco, California to journalists William Prescott Frost and Isabel Moody. His father descended from Nicholas Frost of Tiverton, Devon, England, who had sailed to New Hampshire in 1634 on the Wolfrana, and his mother was a Scottish immigrant.
Biography of William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was a British poet who was born on 7th April 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland, in the Lake District. He continued his studies at Cambridge University. He made his debut as a writer in 1787 when he published a sonnet in the European magazine. He lost his mother when he was 8 years old and his father when he was 13. Domestic arrangements caused William to be separated for 9 years from his beloved sister Dorothy Wordsworth. Poet William Wordsworth worked with Samuel Taylor Coleridge on lyrical ballads. Wordsworth showed his affinity for nature with the famous poem I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud in 1798. He became England's Poet Laureate in 1843, a title he held until his death.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Tanmaning is going to say about renowned poet John Keats. John Keats is an English poet who was one of the most famous poets of 19th century. He was born in 31st October 1795 in England. Although he was an orphan, he studied at Clark's School at London.
William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was one of the founder of English Romanticism and one of its most central figure and important intellects. He is remembered as a poet of spiritual and epistemological speculation, a poet concerned with the human relationship to nature and a fierce advocate of using vocabulary and speech pattern of common people in his poetry.
Robert Frost. Robert Frost was a famous American poet. He was born in the year of 26 March 1874. His father's name is William Periscoe Frost and he was a journalist. Robert Frost has been studied in the Dartmouth College for 11 years. During his 11 years time, he wrote many of these famous poems are Fire and Ice, Mending Walls, Home Built, Out to Out, The Death of a Buried Man, etc. During his lifetime, he got many honorable prizes and degrees for this poem. In this poem, he admired the rural areas of his New England.
Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was one of the most eminent English poets. He is rightly considered as a leader of a new era, a new movement in English poetry. He is the most representative English poet of Romanticism. He was born into a lawyer's family in 1770 at Cockermouth in Cumberland. His parents died when he was a very young boy. After receiving his education, he went on a walking tour in France, Italy, and the Alps. His poem marked a romanticism in poetry.
With John Keats. John Keats was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets, with Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley. He was born on 31st October 1795. By the end of the century, he was placed in the canon of English literature and had become an inspiration for pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, strongly influencing many other writers and
Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was born on May 31, 1819, West Hills, New York, United States. He was an American poet, essayist, and journalist. He is among the most influential poets in the American canon, often called the father of free verse. Whitman's major poetry collection, Leaves of Grass, was first published in 1855 with his own money and became well known. During the American Civil War, he went to Washington, D.C. and worked in hospitals taking care for the wounded.
John Keats. John Keats was born at 31st October 1795 at Margate, London, England. His father's name was Thomas Keats and mother's name was Frances Jennings Keats.
John Keats was an English romantic lyric poet whose virtue is known for its vivid imaginary and great sensational appeal. His reputation grew earlier date and he was greatly admired in the Victorian age. His influence can be seen in the poetry of Alfred, Lord Tennyson and P. Raffles among others.
William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was born on 7th April 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland in the Lake District of England, an area that would become closely associated with Wordsworth for over 2 centuries after his death. William Wordsworth was basically an English romantic poet. He was one of the founders of English Romanticism and one of its most central figures and important intellects. He is always remembered as a poet concerned with human relationship to nature and fierce advocate of using the vocabulary and speech patterns of common people in his poetry.
P.B. Shelley. His full name is Percy Bysshe Shelley and was born on 4th August in 1792 in England. Percy Bysshe Shelley is one of the epic poets of the 19th century and is best known for his classic anthology, wise works such as Ode to the West Wind and Mask of Anarchy. He is also famous for his long-form poetry including Queen Mab and Alastor. Being very sensitive and possessing distinctive qualities of hope, love, joy and happiness, Shelley strongly believed in realization of human happiness. Ozymandias was one of his major contributions to the English poetry published in 11 January in 1818.
My topic is Robert Frost. Robert Frost was one of the finest of rural New England's 20th century pastoral poets. First published his first in Great Britain in his own country, the most read and constantly anthologized poet Frost was awarded the Pulitzer Prize 4 times. He was born in San Francisco, California on March 26, 1879. His father, a journalist and a local politician, died when Frost was 11 years old. His Scottish mother resumed his career as a school teacher to support her family. 1892, Frost graduated from a high school and attended Dartmouth College for a few months.
John Keats was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets. He was born into a family of livery stable keeper. His first volume of poetry, titled Poems, was published in 1817. His famous poem, To Autumn, is considered as one of the most perfect poems in English language. His worship of beauty, richness in literary expressions, and the extraordinary freshness of his poetry make him one of the most popular poets who flourished during the age of Romantic revival in England. He devoted his short life to the perfection of a poem marked by vivid imaginary, great sensuous appeal, and an attempt to express a philosophy through classical legend. The passion of beauty constitutes his aestheticism. Beauty was his pole star, beauty in nature, in women, and in art. Keats made beauty his object of wonder and admiration, and he became the greatest poet of beauty.
P.B. Shelley. Percy Bysshe Shelley is one of the epic, romantic, and one of the most highly regarded and influential English poets of the 19th century. He is best known for his classic anthology verse and also for his long-form poetry. He was born on August 4th, 1792, Horsham, United Kingdom. His parents were Timothy Shelley and Elizabeth Pilfold. Shelley was the oldest of their 7 children. The best-known classic poems of Shelley includes Ode to the West Wind, Ozymandias, Music to a Skylark, The Cloud, The Mask of Anarchy, and When Soft Voice Die.
Walter Whitman, born on May 31, 1819, was an American poet, essayist, and a journalist. A humanist, he was a part of the transition between transcendentalism and realism, incorporating both views in his works. Whitman is among the most influential poets in the American canon, often referred to as the father of free verse. His works were controversial in its time, particularly his poetry collection Leaves of Grass, which was considered obscene due to its overt sensuality. Born on Long Island as a child and through much of his career he resided in Brooklyn. At the age of 11 he left schooling and went to work. Later, Whitman worked as a teacher, a journalist, and a government clerk. His famous poetry collection Leaves of Grass was first published in 1855 with his own money and became famous.
William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was an English romantic poet who, with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, helped to launch the Romantic Age in English literature with his joint publishing Lyrical Ballads. William Wordsworth was born on 7 April 1770 in Cockermouth, United Kingdom, and he died on 23rd April 1830.
Wordsworth was born on 7 April 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland in the Lake District. His father was John Wordsworth, Sir James Lowther's attorney. The magnificent landscape deeply affected Wordsworth's imagination and gave him a love of nature. He lost his mother when he was 8 and 5 years later his father. The domestic problems separated Wordsworth from his beloved and neurotic sister Dorothy, who was a very important person in his life. With the help of his two uncles, Wordsworth entered a local school and continued his studies at Cambridge University. Wordsworth published a sonnet as a writer in 1787.
John Keats, born on 31st October 1975 and died on 23 February 1821, was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets with Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Although his poems had been published for only 4 years, when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25, they were indifferently received in his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death.
That is William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was an English poet, a playwright and an actor. He was born on 26 April 1564 in England. His father was a successful businessman and his mother was the daughter of a landowner. William Shakespeare is widely regarded as the greatest writer of the English language. He is often named as the national poet of England and nicknamed as the Bard of Avon.
Robert Frost. Robert Lee Frost was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco. He was an American leading poet at 20th century. He was highly regarded for his realistic depictions of rural life through language and situation familiar to common man. Some of his famous works include The Road Not Taken, The Fire and Ice, Mending Walls, Out Out, etc. He won 4 Pulitzer Prizes for his work. He even spoke at President John F. Kennedy's inauguration of 1961 as a special guest. Frost became poetic force and unofficial poet laureate of the U.S. For the Frost spent his first 40 years as an unknown, and he exploded himself after returning from England at the beginning of World War I.
Father William Prescott Frost Jr. was a journalist with ambitions of establishing a career in California, and in 1873 he and his wife moved to San Francisco. Her husband's untimely death from tuberculosis in 1885 promoted Isabel Maudie Frost to take her 2 children, Robert and Jenny, to Lawrence, Massachusetts, where they were taken in by children's parental grandparents.
Joseph Rudyard Kipling. Joseph Rudyard Kipling is one of the best known of the late Victorian poets, storyteller, novelist, and an English journalist. He was born on 30 December 1865 in India, which inspired much of his work. He wrote stories such as The Jungle Book, Just So Stories, and Kim, which was one of the most successful novels.
In 1907, he received the Nobel Prize for Literature and became the first English language writer to win the prize. He wrote many poems such as Mandalay, Gunga Din, etc. He lauded British imperialism. In 1892, Kipling married Caroline Ballister, sister of Wolcott Ballister. Kipling suffered from painful ulcer that eventually took his life on 18th January 1936. His ashes were buried in Westminster Abbey in Poets Corner. Thank you.
Good morning, ma'am. Today I am going to say some lines about William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was an English playwright and poet and actor widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and the world's greatest dramatic. He is often called English national poet and the Board of Owen.
Topic is on Robert Frost. Robert Frost was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California. He was a noted and respected American poet of 20th century and winner of 4 Pulitzer Prizes. Famous works include Fire and Ice, Mending Wall, Bridges, and Out Out, etc. His 1916 poem, The Road Not Taken, is often read at graduation ceremonies across the United States. Majority of his work had been published in England as well as America. In the early 20th century, most of his work revolved around rural life in New England, which he used to examine complex social and philosophical themes. Robert Frost was born to journalist father William Prescott Frost and mother Isabel Moody. After William's death, the family moved to Lawrence. In 1982, Robert Frost graduated from Lawrence High School.
Percy Shelley was an English poet of early 19th century. He was thought as one of the important poets of the Romantic movement of English literature. Some of his poems like Ozymandias and Ode to the West Wind are among the most famous in English. Shelley was born on 4 August 1872 in Horsham, Sussex. He was the son of a member of parliament. He attended the University of Oxford for only 1 year as he was expelled for being an atheist. In his own time, Shelley was very unpopular for his political and religious views as well as personal conduct. Shelley married young but left his wife to run away with Mary Godwin. After his first wife committed suicide, he married Mary Godwin, who later became famous as Mary Shelley, the author of novel Frankenstein. Shelley left England and spent most of his life traveling in Europe, especially in Italy. He became a close friend of Lord Byron, who also left England and traveled in Europe because of controversy at home.
Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was an American poet. Little known during her life, she has been regarded as one of the most important figures in American poetry. Dickinson was born in Emmet into a prominent family. While Dickinson was a prolific writer, her only publication during her lifetime were 10 of her nearly 1,800 poems and 1 letter. Her poems were unique of her era. They contain short lines, typical black titles, and often used slant rhymes. Although Dickinson's acquaintances were most likely aware of her writing, it was not until her death in 1886 when Lavinia, Dickinson's younger sister, discovered her case of poems that her work became public. Her first collection of poetry was published in 1890. 11 of her poems were dedicated to sister-in-law Susan Huntington Gilbert.
John Keats was one of England's greatest poets. He was born in London on 31st October 1795. His father, Thomas Keats, was an innkeeper and his mother was called Frances. As a teenager, Keats became passionately fond of poetry, and when he was about 18, he wrote his first poem, one entitled Imitation Spencer. In 1816, he had a poem published for the first time in a magazine called The Examiner. It was a sonnet called O Solitude. Then, in 1817, he published a book called Poems. However, it wasn't a success. Nevertheless, Keats continued writing. His epic poem Endymion was published in 1818. During 1818 to 1819, he wrote some great poems including Hyperion, Ode to Autumn, etc. However, in 1820, Keats fell ill with tuberculosis and eventually died in Rome.
Robert Lee Frost, England's cherished poet, has been called America's purest classical lyricist and one of the extraordinary poets of 20th century. He was born on 26 March 1876 in San Francisco, California. Majority of his work has been published in England as well as America. He was highly regarded due to his realistic depiction of rural life and commands of American colloquial speech. During the early 20th century, his work mostly revolved around the rural life of England, from which he used to examine complex social and philosophical themes. His noted works are West Running Brook, Fire and Ice, The Road Not Taken, etc. He was frequently honored during his lifetime, winning
on John Keats. John Keats was an English poet who was one of the most gifted and appealing poets on 19th century. John Keats was born in London in October 31, 1795. He became an orphan at the early age. Jones attended a school at Enfield, but in the fall of 1810, Keats left the school for studies to become a surgeon.
On my favorite poet. Well, I admire the composition of many poets and writers, but my favorite is John Keats, the composer of many poems. Therefore, today I would give a short speech on the life and works of John Keats. John Keats was born on October 31st, 1795 in London, England. He was an English romantic lyric poet who devoted his short life to the perfection of poetry, marked by vivid imagery, great sensuous appeal, and an attempt to express a philosophy through classical legend. Though he became an orphan in an early age, but he studied medicine, yet he did not practice, but gave his life to the writings in 1816. His important works are Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Autumn, etc. Thank you.
Robert Lee Frost was born in March 26, 1874. He was an American poet. His work was initially published in England before it was published in the United States. Frost frequently wrote about the setting of rural life in New England in the early 20th century, using them to examine complex social and philosophical themes. Frost was honored frequently during his lifetime and is the only poet who received 4 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. He became one of the America's rare public literary figures, almost an artistic institution.
John Keats was born on 31 October 1795, was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets, with Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, although his poems had been published only for 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25. They were indifferently received in his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death. By the end of the century, he was placed in the canon of English literature and had become an inspiration for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, strongly influencing many writers. The Encyclopedia Britannica called one ode one of the pre-final masterpieces. George Louis Burks named his first encounter with Keats an experience that he felt all his life.
Frost was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco. He was an American poet. Earlier, he was an editor of the San Francisco Evening Bulletin. Robert Frost published his first poem in his high school magazines.
Want to convey a short speech on American most beloved and well-known poet. The name of the poet is Robert Lee Frost. Robert Lee Frost was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California. He was a noted and critically respected American poet of 20th century. Majority of his work had been published in England as well as America. He is still known for his realistic descriptions of real life and his command over congenial speech. In the early 20th century, most of his work revolved around rural life in New England, which he used to examine complex social and philosophical themes.
More than any other great English poet, William Wordsworth was a poet for nature and thoughtful appreciation. Except for a very small part of his work, many readers must readily acquire the taste for him. He was born in 7 April 1770 in Crooksmont, England. Wordsworth was 7 years old when his mother died. Despite this loss, he did well in Oxford Grammar School. When he wrote his first poetry, he went to study at Cambridge University. He did not excel there, but managed to graduate in 1791.
Robert Lee Frost was a well-known American poet. He was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco, United States. His famous work include Out Out, Fire and Ice, Road Not Taken, and Home Burial. By 1915, he has published two full-length collections, The Boy's Will and The North of Boston, and by then, his reputation was established in the field of poetry and arts. Talking about his achievement, he won 4 Pulitzer Prizes. The first for his book New Hemisphere in 1924. Second in the year 1931 for the collected poems. Third in 1937 for the further range. And fourth and the last in 1943 for a witness 3.
Robert Frost. Robert Frost is a well-known American poet. He was born in March 26, 1874 in San Francisco. His father's name is William Prescott Frost and his mother is Isabella Moody. His father died from tuberculosis when he was 11 years old. Robert Frost is one of the most widely read and beloved American poets as well as one of the greatest 4 times Pulitzer Prize winning poets. Robert Frost was a national celebrity famous for writing poems about rural life in American colloquial speech. Robert Frost is well known for poems that he managed to lose in everyone's head.
John Keats was a paragon figure in the realm of English romantic poetry. He wore his mantle mainly due to his virtuosity in his language and the prime of his life. Keats was born on October 31st, 1795 to Thomas and Frances Keats. Thomas worked at the stable of the Swan and Hoops Inn, which he later managed. Keats himself was described as a volatile child, always in the extremes, and his uncertain family life did not help give him any more orders. At the age of 15, Keats decided to pursue medicine and was subsequently apprenticed with the surgeon and apothecary Thomas Hammond for 3 years. Keats found himself drawn more to poetry. In 1819, he wrote an Ode on a Gracious Urn, Ode to the Nightingale, among others. He died on February 23, 1821 and was buried along with the unopened letters from Fanny Brown, a lock of her hair.
John Keats. One of the greatest of English poets was John Keats. He was born in London in the year 1795. He became so famous later on, but he was not so bright and brilliant in his boyhood. He began his medical profession as an apprentice to a doctor, but later he gave up his medical profession after a few years. His innate and inherent love towards English made him learn and study Greek and English. Then he started writing poems, of which Ode to Nightingale, Ode Autumn, and To One Who Has Belonged in a City Pen deserve mention. But unfortunately, this great poet was attacked with TB consumption, which was detected in 1820. As his health broke down, he went to Italy to regain his lost health, but unfortunately, he could not recover from this dangerous disease and ultimately died in the year 1821. Despite of his short life, John Keats was one of the finest poets that England could ever produce.
John Donne. John Donne was born on 22 January 1572 in London, England. He was an English poet, scholar, soldier and secretary born into a Rakusan family and later became a cleric in the Church of England. He is considered as the premier representative of the metaphysical poets. His poetical works are noted for their metaphorical and sensual style, which includes sonnets, love poems, religious poems, Latin translations, epigrams, elegies, songs and satires. He is also known for his
about a famous poet, Robert Frost. Robert Frost's full name was Robert Lee Frost. He was born on March 26, 1874 in San Francisco, California, USA. He was an American poet who depicted the realistic New England's life through language and situations familiar to one's common man. He also won 4 Pulitzer Prizes for his works and spoke at John F. Kennedy's 1961 inauguration. In November 8, 1994, Robert Frost's first poem, named My Butterfly and Elige, was the first poem by Frost ever sold and his first professional published poem. The difference between Frost and other poets is the former treats nature and real part of life. At last, Robert died on January 29, 1963 in Boston, Massachusetts.
I'll be talking about the famous poet Robert Frost. Robert Frost was an American poet who depicted the realistic life of New England through his language as well as by referring to the different situations prevailing on the common people. He also was awarded with 4 Pulitzer Prizes for his famous works such as Fire and Ice, Mending Wall, Out Out, Home Burial, and Nothing Gold Can Stay. He was also invited in the inauguration ceremony of the President John F. Kennedy in 1916, where he got his unofficial title as the Poet Laureate and was also referred to as the Poetic Force. His famous poem was Road Not Taken, which he also wrote in 1916. This poem is still heard to be recited in the graduation ceremonies all over America. Because of his descriptive writings and realistic nature, he is still famous.
Born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco, he later moved to England around 11 years old. He spent most of his life there and it played a pivotal role in his work. Frost taught at various levels and had a strong interest in nature and science, though he never earned a formal degree there. He also ran a farm which was handed down from his grandfather, where he raised his family. He was married and had 6 children. Unfortunately, death plagued the Frost family, which took his father, mother, sister, wife, and 2 of his children.
Robert Frost was born in 1874, San Francisco, California. His mother was Scottish descent and his father was journalist named William Prescott Frost. He was descended from Nicholas Frost of Tiverton, Devon, England, who had sailed to New Hampshire in 1634. Frost's father was a teacher. After his death on May 5, 1885, the family moved across the country to Lawrence. Frost had many jobs including he taught Latin, textile, etc. Most of his poems came from his life's experience and loneliness. In 1895, he married Eleanor White. Most of his married life was spent in England. He was colorblind. He always wanted to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Frost died on 29 January 1960.
Robert Frost was an American poet and winner of 4 Pulitzer Prizes. He was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco, California. Frost was well known for his realistic writings on rural life. He was much admired for his depictions of the realistic New England life through language and situations familiar to the common man. His famous works were Fire and Ice, Mending Wall, Bitches, Out, Nothing Gold Can Stay, Home Burial, and The Road Not Taken. He became one of America's rare public literary figure, almost an artistic institution. On 29 January 1963, he died in Boston of complications due to
William Wordsworth. Poet William Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1770 in Cockermouth, Cumberland, England. Wordsworth's mother died when he was 7 and he was an orphan at 13. Despite these losses, he did well at Hogshead Grammar School, where he wrote his first poetry and went to study at Cambridge University. He did not excel there but managed to graduate in 1791.
John Donne was an English poet, scholar, soldier, and secretary who was born into a Quaker family on 22 January 1572. He later became a cleric in the Church of England. Under royal patronage, he was made Dean of St. Public's Cathedral in London. He is considered the preeminent representative of the metaphysical poets. He is often considered the greatest love poet in the English language. His poetic works are noted for their metaphorical and sensual style and include sonnets, love poems, religious poems, Latin translations, epigrams, elegies, songs, and satires. He is also known for his sermons, which rank among the best in the 17th century. He took the last breath of his life on 31 March 1631.
Robert Lee Frost was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco, California, to a journalist father William Prescott Frost and mother Isabel Moody. He was a noted and critically respected American poet of the 20th century. Majority of his work had been published in England and as well as in America. He is still known for his realistic depictions of rural life and his command over colloquial speech. In the early 20th century, most of his work revolved around the rural life in New England, where he used to examine complex social and psychological.
John Keats was born in London on 31 October in 1795. He was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets, with Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, although his poems had been published for only 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25.
Whitman was a famous poet of New York. His full name was Walter Whitman. Walter Whitman was born on May 31, 1819 in New York. He was born into a family that settled in North America.
Walt Whitman was an American poet, essayist, and journalist. Born 31st May 1819, he was a humanist, blending both realism and transcendentalist views in his works. He worked as a nurse during the Civil War and greatly admired Lincoln. He penned the poem "O Captain, My Captain" in his honor after Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Whitman is best known for his poetry collection Leaves of Grass. He was pretty opposed to alcohol and supported prohibition. Whitman is among the most influential poets in the American canon, often called the father of free verse. His work was controversial in its time. Whiteman's own life scrutiny for his presumed
Keats was born on Margate, London on 31st October 1795. He was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poets with Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley. Although his poems were published for only 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25, they were indifferently received in his lifetime, but his fame grew rapidly after his death. By the end of the century, he was placed in the canon of the English literature and had become an inspiration. Today, his poems remain among the most popular analyzed in English literature.
William Wordsworth, one of the most famous Romantic poets, excelled in vivid and joyous description of nature. Wordsworth is specially regarded as a poet of nature as he was a true worshipper of nature. He basically used to write lyrical ballads.
Robert Lee Frost was an American poet. His work was published in England before it was published in United States. He was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco and he died in 19 January 1963 in Boston. His father's name was William Prescott Frost and his mother's name was Isabella Montaigne. He got married in 19 December 1895 with the lady named Eleanor Frost, and he was also awarded by the Putlis Award for Poetry, and he wrote many poems like The Road Not Taken, The Fire and Ice, and also the famous Nothing Gold Can Stay.
He was born on 22 January 1572 in London. He was the third of 6 children. His father's name was also John Donny and his mother's name was Elizabeth Haywood. John Donny was an English poet, scholar, soldier and a security born into a Reculant family who later became the cleric in the Church of England.
Robert Frost. Robert Frost was an American poet who depicted New England life through language and situation familiar to the common man. He was born on 26 March 1874 in San Francisco, California. Robert Frost spent first 11 years of his life there, and after high school he attended Dartmouth College. In
Walt Whitman, the most influential American poet, and is often called the father of free verse. He was the second of 9 children born to Walter Whitman, a house builder, and Louisa Van Velsor, born on May 31, 1819. The first edition of his books of poems, Leaves of Grass, was published in 1855.
I am going to deliver a short speech on John Keats. John Keats, an English poet who was one of the most gifted and applied in 19th century. John Keats was born in London in October 31, 1795. He became an orphan at early age. Anyway, he was educated at the Clock School in Enfield.
William Shakespeare was born on 25th April 1564 at Sandford-upon-Avon, England.
Robert Frost was born in San Francisco, California to journalists William Prescott Frost and Isabel Moody. He was an American poet. His work was published in England before it was published in the United States, known for his realistic depictions of rural life and American colloquial speech. Frost often wrote about the forms of settlement of rural life in England in the early 21st century and used them to examine complex social and philosophical themes. Frost often was honored with prizes and was the first poet to receive 4 Pulitzer Awards.
Robert Frost. Robert Frost is an American poet who depicted New England life through language and situations familiar to common man. He won 4 Pulitzer Prizes for his work. Some of his famous works include Fire and Ice, Mending Walls, Out and Out, Road Not Taken, and many more. His 1916 poem, Road Not Taken, is often read at graduation ceremonies across the United Nations. Frost spent his first 40 years as an unknown.
P.B. Shelley, so let's start a video. P.B. Shelley was born in 4 August 1792 at Field Place near Sussex, England. His father's name was Timothy Shelley and his mother's name was Elizabeth. She was the very oldest of 6 children.
He had two brothers and four sisters. In 1804, she sent to Eton, and then in 1810, she went to college. She went to University College, Oxford. Meanwhile, she wrote Zetrosky, and it was published in 1810 with his sister Elizabeth. Shelley also wrote a original poetry by Victor, and it
was born on 31st October in 1795 in London, in England. John Keats was an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poet with Lord Byron. Although his poems had been published for only 4 years when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25, he was
Percy Bysshe Shelley, popularly known as P.B. Shelley, is one of the major English Romantic poets. She was born on 4th August 1792 at Horsham, Sussex, England. Her parents were Timothy Shelley and Elizabeth Pilfold. Among his best-known works are Ozymandias, Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark, and the political ballad The Mask of Anarchy. His other major works include the verse drama The Cenci and the long poems such as Alistair or The Spirit of Solitude, Julian and Meadowlark, Adonais, Prometheus Unbound, his widely considered masterpiece Hellas, and his final unfinished work The Triumph of Life. Shelley also wrote prose, fictions, and a quantity of essays on political, social, and philosophical issues.
Wordsworth was an English romantic poet who, with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, helped to launch the Romantic Age in English literature with their joint publication Lyrical Ballads. William Wordsworth was born on 7th April 1770 in Cockermouth, United Kingdom, and he died on 23rd April 1850 in Royal Mount End Garden, United Kingdom.
A short speech on John Keats. John Keats was one of the finest English poets of the Romantic school of writing. He was born on 31st October 1795 to Thomas and Frances Jennings Keats in central London. His father was a livery stable keeper but died when Keats was only 8 years old. He grew up in his grandmother's home at Edmonton near London. In 1816, he became a licensed apothecary, but he never practiced his profession, deciding instead to write poetry. He published his first volume poem in 1817 and his ambitious allegorical narrative poem Endymion in 1818. In July 1820, he published his third and best volume of poetry, Lamia Isabella, The Eve of Saint Agnes, and other poems.
William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was born on 7 April 1770 at Cockermouth in Cumbria. His father was a lawyer. Both Wordsworth's parents died before he was 15, and he and his 4 siblings were left in the care of their different relatives.
Robert Lee Frost was born on 26 March 1874 in California. His father was William Prescott Frost and mother was Isabelle Moody. In 1982, he was graduated from Lawrence High School. Frost grew up in the city and he published his first poem in his high school magazine. He was a noted and critically respected American poet of 20th century.
Keats has been born on 31 October 1795, but sadly he died due to tuberculosis at the end of the 23 February 1821. He was an English poet portrayed in the second generation of Romantic poets with Lord Byron, although his poem has been published for only 4 years because he sadly died due to the tuberculosis at the age of 25.
Poet John Keats. He was born in London in the year 1795. Keats, who became so famous later on, was not so bright and brilliant in his boyhood. He began his medical profession in 1810 as an apprentice to a doctor, but he gave up this profession after a few years in 1817. In the meantime, his initial and innate love of literature made him study and learn Greek and English literature.
John Keats was born on 31st October 1795 in United Kingdom. He was an renowned English prominent romantic poet with Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley. Although his poems were published for only 4 years and he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25. Keats' training took up increasing amount of his writing time and he became an increasingly irrelevant about it.
John Keats was born in London on 31 October 1795. John Keats is an English poet prominent in the second generation of Romantic poet with Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley. Although his poem had been published for only 4 years, when he died of tuberculosis at the age of 25.
John Keats. John Keats was born in London on 31 October 1795. The eldest of Thomas and Frances Jennings Keats' 4 children. Although he died at the age of 25, Keats has perhaps the most remarkable career of any English poet. He published only 54 poems in 3 slim volumes and a few magazines, but over his short development, he took on the challenges of a wide range of poetic forms from the sonnet.
P.B. Shelley, or Percy B. Shelley, was one of the most famous English romantic poets. He was born on 4th August 1792 at United Kingdom. His parents were Timothy Shelley and Elizabeth Pilfool. Shelley did not achieve fame during his lifetime, but recognition of his achievements in poetry grew steadily following his death, and he became an important influence on the subsequent generation of poets, including Robert Browning, Thomas Hardy, William Butler Yeats, etc. Shelley's critical reputation fluctuated on the 20th century, but in recent decades he has achieved a critical acclaim for the sweeping momentum of his poetic imaginary. Among his best-known works were Ozymandias, Ode to the West Winds, To the Skylark, etc. Shelley also wrote prose fiction and a quantity of essays on political, social, and philosophical issues. Much of his poetry and prose were not published during his lifetime or only published in expurgated form due to the risk of prosecution of political and religious libel.
John Keats, an English poet, is one of the most gifted and appealing poets of the 19th century. He was born in London on 31st October 1795. He was born to Jane Keats and Thomas Keats. Though he became an orphan at an early age, but he completed his studies from Clerk's School in Enfield.
John Keats, an English poet who was one of the most gifted and appealing poet of the 17th century. John Keats was born in London in October 31, 1795 AD. He became an orphan at an early age. Anyway, he was educated at the Clerk's School in Enfield. Keats studied medicine also, but he never practiced his profession.